Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's panel discussion. My name is Adrian Dellecker, and I'm honored to be your host for a conversation we entitled, Can we redesign conservation funding? This moment is the product of a collaboration between the Luke Hoffmann Institute and Internet of Elephants. We've teamed up to see if we can unlock new sources of revenue for the conservation of wildlife, looking specifically into gamification as a means to add value to wildlife data. We've had such fascinating discussions with so many people, and many people I want to take this opportunity now to thank in this creative process, that we simply wanted to open it up and invite more people in, invite you to inputs, invite your questions, invite your concerns, and feed into this panel today and subsequently afterwards as well. So we're really thrilled to have you today, thrilled that you're joining this panel. Before we start, I want to go through just a bit of quick housekeeping. First of all, this session is being recorded. We are planning on putting it on our channels subsequently. This should only really affect the speakers because as participants, you're not visible and we cannot hear you or see the content of the chats when this goes up on video. But so you know, please really feel free to use the chat. You can use it to talk to each other. You can try and ask questions to the panel. We've got a team behind the scenes that will pick up on some of the questions. And in the second part, I will relay some of those questions. But really, please use it, be interactive, talk to each other, exchange LinkedIn profiles, whatever it is, use the chat box for that. We want this to be interactive, so enjoy. I want to introduce the panel now. I'm very excited. I've got tremendous respect and admiration for this panel. I'm really excited to have them all together today to talk to us. The first I want to introduce is Alice Ruhweza. She is Regional Director for WWF. She's a seasoned practitioner of sustainable development, particularly innovative finance and conservation funding. She's spent the last 20 years on sustainable development. I know her personally as a very energetic advocate of bold action and innovative approaches to conservation. So I'm very excited to have her vision on this panel today. David Gonahasa is an entrepreneur and conservationist. He's co-founder of the Naturalist. He's harnessing tech to create new opportunities for gorilla conservation through his initiative called Home of the Gorillas. David's venture was one of 15 to win the Innovation Challenge we ran last year with WWF Africa and the Africa Leadership University. So I also like to think that he's representing that brilliant cohort of African entrepreneurs. So special shout out to that cohort, to Africa Leadership University, and to the students I know who are joining us today. Gautam Shah is founder of Internet of Elephants, which is also, as I said, a partner in this. Gautam quit a perfectly good career as an IT consultant to start a tech for wildlife company. So I'm very curious to hear his experience. He's got a wealth of it in running a conservation-driven startup focused on games. Dr. Kirsten Oberpreeler is CEO of Pentaquest and a leading expert in gamification and design thinking. She's an academic, but a practitioner as well, having chosen to found a company that applies cutting-edge behavioral science and gamification to improve engagement, learning, and development in companies. So thank you all for joining. As I said, I'm very excited to have you here. My first question is to you, Alice. As you're the director of WWF, one of the biggest conservation organizations, and in Africa, one of the most important regions for conservation. You've got a lot of experience in fundraising and conservation finance, even before joining WWF. So I'm curious to know, how much has conservation funding evolved over time? What are some of the greatest challenges you face in raising funds for conservation? And immediately I'd even ask you, what are some of the things that you wish would change?
Thank you very much, Adrian, and thank you, everyone. Pleased to be here to talk about finance, something that is close to my heart. And yes, Adrian, I've been in the sector for a very long time. And yes, I will agree. I will agree that the funding for conservation has evolved and it has increased. I like to imagine that during my time, my father's time, when he was head of protected areas in the 60s, in the 70s, most of that funding was coming in from our governments. But we've seen over the years, I mean, there's foundations, there's high net worth individuals, there's public organizations, the Global Environment Facility and others. There's a lot of funding coming in. But one point that remains clear is that we're still perennially underfunded, that the sector is still underfunded, and the money that we are raising from everywhere is still not enough. And then the second point is also that it's tended to be a single sector focus. So even at national level, the funding for conservation remains really in the natural resources sector. And so we are not having all of these sectors coming in and contributing to that. And that's something that we need to look at. And then also, particularly in Africa, we don't have as much interest from our own citizens to really contribute to conservation. We see that around the world, particularly in for example, WWF, a lot of our offices, whether it's Germany, whether it's United States, whether it's UK, they have a lot of individuals contributing to our work here. But in Africa, we are yet to tap into that sector. Which brings me to the three things that I really want to see us do going forward and engage more. So one of those for me is, again, I go back to domestic resource mobilization, because I believe that we should, as Africans, and our governments should be interested in funding this sector because of its value to us and because of its value to our economy. And way back when I started working, I used to work for the National Environment Management Authority. And my job in Uganda back then was to mainstream environment into policies and plans of all the sectors, the different sectors. And it was a difficult job. Not everybody was interested. They would see it as something only for the National Environment Management Authority or the Ministry of Water and Environment. But I remember one thing we succeeded in doing is placing a desk officer in the Ministry of Finance, and using her to lobby the Ministry of Finance about increasing finance. And some success there, but something that I would like to see us do even more. And that really relates also to policy coherence, because if we do not mainstream nature across all sectors and start to make the case for nature's contribution to all sectors, then all sectors will not necessarily be interested in contributing to that. So that's, for me, that's one area that I would like to see us do more. The second one is around engaging our citizens. I mentioned earlier that we haven't had that. I mean, I remember when I was in college, I received an envelope from World Vision asking for $20 per month to contribute to the education for a girl in Zambia. And her story was so good, it caught my eye. And even as a student, I started contributing to that. How can I get our citizens also interested in the work we're doing so that they actually contribute, or ask their parents to contribute to this? And the last point is, then if we succeed there, then we can start even getting our own citizens to hold our governments accountable for this. Because if I'm paying $20 for elephant protection, I can also ask the government, why is this happening, or why is that not happening? I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. That's great. I'm going to get back to you on the engaging citizens, because that's clearly a very, it's close to this project, and I'm really keen to hear your views on that. So be ready. But first, I'm turning to Gautam. I'm very curious about your experience as a founder. It's a relatively rare thing in conservation. You say you quit a perfectly good career to pursue environmental impact, but you chose the for-profit model of the social enterprise rather than the NGO. So what's been your experience? What are some of the advantages that this has brought? What are some of the disadvantages? And just to be a little bit provocative, any regrets?
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Yeah, so I mean, I spent 20 years working for a large 400,000 person company called Accenture. And that's what I used to do. And so, risk taking and entrepreneurship wasn't really kind of what you were bred for. So the switch into entrepreneurship, I mean, that was just way bigger than getting into wildlife conservation or anything like that. Making a decision to become an entrepreneur, probably by far the scariest aspect of it. The decision. We get caught up a lot into, like, is this for profit or is this non-for-profit? I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, whatever organization you're going to start is going to have to generate revenue, right? And then you can decide what you want to do with profits. You can reinvest them. You can distribute it to shareholders. You can just try really hard not to get profits. So, like all of that, I think it's a lot of attention. But at the end of the day, no matter what type of organization you are, you're going to have a model by which you generate revenue. And if that model is you're going to go out to individual donors, you're going to go out to big foundations, you're going to try and sell licenses. No matter what you do, you're going to have to figure out a model for how you're going to have to generate revenue. And so I wasn't nearly as concerned about for-profit or not-for-profit. Some of that was just based on certain circumstances, tax implications, etc. But what we really wanted, what we really felt was that a commercial approach, a commercial mentality to attacking this problem, that's what we absolutely needed to have, right? And so I was really, maybe ignorantly, but I was afraid if I became a typical NGO, that we would just kind of fall into the same patterns that maybe we could have been, okay at it, but I'm not sure we would have really tried to come up with something different. And so I really wanted to take a very customer-focused approach to conservation. So rather than always, and again, my beliefs as somebody that wasn't in the conservation space is, wow, the conservation sector looks at everybody not as customers, but in ways of like, okay, what can we get from them? Right? It's just always like, what can we get from them, and how can that benefit our organization? And I just thought having a commercial entity, a for-profit, might force us into thinking about things in another way, which is what do our customers want from us? What do our customers get from conservation? How can we think of ourselves as value providers, as service providers in a particular way? So that I always had this customer first mentality about things, and anything that we thought about always put the audience first. And so that's really kind of the primary reason that we went in that direction, as opposed to anything financially. Look, I think, to tell you the truth, the biggest impact that it's had on us is how do we raise money. And often I think like, oh man, it'd just be so much easier to just go and ask somebody for a grant, and then they could just pay for this. And you're in a way, as a for-profit, this double bottom line that you've got of trying to show impact and a financial return. You're always kind of big broad metrics, and sometimes I wish like, oh, it'd just be great if we could just measure ourselves just on whether we made money, because that would be easy to at least think about. Or if we could just measure ourselves on the impact, and do we sustain ourselves, and kind of having to do both of those has been, it's been difficult. I don't have any regrets about it. I definitely wouldn't do this differently again. I do a lot of things differently, but I wouldn't make a different decision with regards to the for-profit or the non-for-profit model about it. But certainly a lot of learnings, and most of the, I'll just kind of summarize and say most of the impact for us has been, how do we go about raising money? Who do we go to when we raise money, and how do we pitch the value proposition in a way that addresses both the impact as well as the business model.
Thanks, that's great. I hope there's a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs on this call, and that's heartening. This question of looking at people as customers as opposed to sort of the charitable model is something I'd love to get back to later. It's really fascinating, and it's a little bit related to the segue. A question to Kirsten next. You're not just a gamification expert, but a gamification believer, and you started your own company, so also an entrepreneur. I just want to ground this a little bit first. I was wondering if you, as an expert, could give us not a definition, but tell our audience a little bit about what is gamification, and then tell us a little bit about how you see this applying to conservation, since you actually don't really come from a conservation background. Your view will be particularly interesting.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So gamification is the use of game mechanics and experience design to engage users and solve real-world problems. So a game mechanic is essentially a component of a game. The difference between games and gamification is that games are for fun or for pleasure, for enjoyment, and gamification is to use that approach, but to solve real-world problems. More and more gamification is becoming accepted. It's been around for quite a while, but it's increasingly popular as people are realizing its potential to apply it to a range of different areas. In terms of common examples, people may be familiar with Duolingo, the world's largest language learning app. Really playful approach for breaking down content, encouraging people to come back and form the habit of learning a new language. We're seeing elements of gamifications and things like Fitbit and Apple Watch and a whole bunch of other platforms that are using this approach to engage users more and solve these real world problems. As you said, I'm not from the conservation space, but this is a topic that's quite close to my heart. I was reflecting on this. So I was born in South Africa. My father's a scientist, a biologist, and so it's been a lot of time visiting national parks and understanding, the different animals and engaging with them. When I then moved to Australia, one of the first ways that I fell in love with Australia was through its fauna and flora. So I don't know if we have any Australians on the call, but or if anyone's familiar with these, but we had these little things called yowies, which was essentially chocolate that you would open. You'd have a little plastic thing, you could open it and you could put together these Australian animals, and they come with a little information pack and you could learn about them. And so for me, I think that was a way that I could connect with the environment, but through a really playful way. And so I'm really interested to explore that today, but rather than using chocolate, using game mechanics as a way to engage people with conservation.
That's great. So we've heard the word engaging quite a lot, and this shift to the customer mentality. So I think we're getting onto something with the gamification. David, I want to ask you about your latest venture. I know you've had a few. Your latest venture is called Home of the Gorillas, and gorilla trekking, notably in Uganda and Rwanda, where I think you're active, is often looked to as a good and desirable model for funding their conservation, but also highly dependent on tourism. So where do you see the future of this industry after COVID, and what's special about your approach? What are you trying to solve?
Thank you, Adrian. So first of all, trekking does work. That's the most important thing to note, because Uganda made about $20 million in 2019 and sold about 43,000 trekking permits. Now, the challenge with this, though, is that for trekking to provide sufficient funding, it has to be able to scale and grow, right? And the challenge here, number one, is that for you to scale trekking, either you need to increase the number of permits you're selling, so from 10 to 20, or you need to increase the number of gorilla families you are habituated, okay? And what this implies then is increased pressure on the forest and all the negative effects that come along with that. COVID-19 further just shows that trekking only works when tourists come, right? If the tourists don't come, trekking does not work, which then creates, huge deficiencies as regards conservation funding in the protected areas. So we found that it's important to find new ways to fund conservation. And what's interesting is that this project actually was the brainchild of someone from the community, right? So initially when they approached us, it was around creating a festival and sort of what normally happens with, non-trekking based fundraising. So it's either run for adoption type strategies, or it's, sort of get people to go into these communities and do some stuff and create some money. But you normally will realize what's being raised is very small amounts of money. It's very important for us to start to really think how to change fundraising for conservation, right? So on one part, it's important to understand who all the stakeholders are, because what normally happens is that a community says, we want to go and raise money for trekking, and we'll fly to America and Europe and run a big campaign and hopefully get some money in. What needs to happen is start with the local communities. They need to understand what's going on, understand what is the value of conserving these gorillas. Because if as a Ugandan, I don't understand why I should conserve gorillas, I have no interest in it, right? And this also extends across the world. Number two, the governments need to also appreciate there's other ways to create revenue as opposed to purely selling permits. And then number three, of course, international audiences and everyone else, right? The next thing is we need to then move away from what we were doing previously and start to use the new technology. And this is what we're doing with the Home of the Gorillas initiative. Basically, one, how do we create awareness and interest at a very mass level? Okay, so yes, you can run the best communications campaign, get the best artists and actors to be a part of it, but eventually we need the individual to actually appreciate what they're doing. So how do you drive interest? Value. Right? Some form of course there's intrinsic value around, yes, I'm saving a species and that. But what about you actually go a step further and say, let's create some extrinsic value, right? Can you earn points for something that you do? Can you actually make money off it, right? So at this point, we're really considering going with the gamification approach, and I'm happy to be part of this panel and learn from the people who are speaking, but also looking at other options, right? What if we went the blockchain angle or able to issue a crypto token? so people can actually buy a digital asset they can use to contribute to guerrilla funding. So there's so many ways that this can be done, and I think we're at the very starting point and happy to be exploring how to make this work.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so the first round is finished. I've got plenty more questions, so we're not going to run out of questions. I do also want to invite you all to react to each other's comments, but I want to go back maybe a little bit to the engaging citizens, and this question is, I think, absolutely key. And David, you talk about the gorillas. I had the chance of going to see the gorillas. I paid what was a lot of money even for me, and let alone for others. Sometimes, well, oftentimes closer to them, and it's really hard to come to grips with the fact that the conservation of wildlife won't benefit the local communities immediately, because if we don't, it seems to me like if you don't crack that, it'll be really hard to get the citizens, like Alice was saying, to get citizens to care so much. So there's nobody in particular, maybe Alice, because you talked about engaging citizens, but I'm looking at the whole panel, and Kirsten included, about, is gamification not necessarily the only one, but is that a possible tool to try and engage citizens more, and maybe even citizens that are closer to wildlife, because that would be a great benefit, not just increasing funding, but increasing the engagement locally. Should I ask Alice directly, or does somebody want to jump in? Please feel free. Oh, you're on mute, Alice.
I should know more about unmuting right now. No, yes, I'll jump in quickly. I mean, I'm excited, for example, that Kirsten is not from our sector, because I think our sector needs to engage people outside of our sector to actually really make progress. We need the whole of society approaches what I'm talking about, and I think gamification actually has a chance. I'll give you an example. This year, so WWF celebrates 60 years. And as a team in Africa, we sat and started to think about what is it that we should do to celebrate 60 years. And we actually invited Gautam here from the Internet of Elephants to help us brainstorm. And we came up with so many ideas: a book, an art exhibition, a video with our various stakeholders. But in the end, we ended up choosing a game, because we looked back and we said, who do we want to engage? Who is the majority of our population at the moment? Over 70% is under the age of 22. It's the young population, and this is our future. And we want them engaged. We want them engaged in conservation, and we want to engage them in the way that they would understand more, so that they would find fun. And I was using my 14-year-old daughter as my guinea pig, and when I showed her Unseen Empire, she went in there and she was so excited about it. So was I, but I'm already converted, and always wanted to go the next step. The way the game shows you what species exist. First and foremost, we were amazed at how many species existed that we didn't know about, and how we kept going farther and farther and learning more. And of course, the guessing game was always very good. Which one is this? And we think it's this and it's not that. And I realized we have this big asset. WWF has been collecting camera trap data for the last 60 years in amazing places in East and Southern Africa, but obviously, of course, Asia and Latin America. And what if we could put that in a similar game like Unseen Empire and start engaging our users on this? First and foremost, you get to learn things you've never seen before. You get to learn what has changed over those last 60 years, what was there before and what is now there that was never there, looking at the impact of the conservation work. But also, you also get to see the other side of what has disappeared, what you used to see before that's no longer there, and also to really use the same data to influence policy. And that's what we've landed on. That's what we are going to do. And we are very excited about it, because we see this as something that is going to engage people, not once at a 60-year-old event, but over and over and over and over in the work. But also our scientists in the field are excited, because all the effort they put in to place those cameras in just the right places to get the data now is going to come out in the public. And so we'll engage not just the youth, but also the public. So I see that as really having a future. So Kirsten, very excited to see.
Yeah. There's a couple of different angles that would be really interesting to explore with everyone. the first thing I want to share is that anything that can be measured can be turned into a game. And so this is this really interesting concept of we have this data, either from research or from like the tracking data. So there is data there. So it's ripe. It's ready for us to do something with it and put it in this engaging format. The other thing I've been thinking about is this concept of a citizen scientist. Now, my father's a scientist, hates that term because he's like, you're not a scientist unless a PhD. But anyway, the idea is that, we can crowdsource, whether it's, taking pictures or tracking all these sorts of things. And so there's something for me there about how do you engage people, and you were speaking about the younger generations, Alice. So, can we tap into that and get this happening? And I know Pokemon Go is a sort of overused example, but if we just use that as an example, took the world by storm. We've got people chasing virtual animals, trying to, train them and have them evolve and grow and things like that. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could harness even just a little bit of that for real animals and nature, that needs our help now. So yeah, there's a couple of different threads there that would be really interesting.
Thank you. In the spirit of games and keeping this fun, we had a couple of polls for the audience. You can, I think one or two will pop up on your screen at some point. These are not scientific. It's not citizen science, let alone real science, but it's more a little bit for fun, but to get a little bit of feedback as well. So feel free to just click on those, and we'll crowdsource those. So a couple of things. One is I'm very interested in youth, and maybe Kirsten, you can start from a place of, is there any kind of evidence that that games are speaking more to youth? We heard Alice with her 14-year-old child, and maybe to David and Gautam. David, about are you looking at games? Are you looking at sort of these new audiences? And then another topic, which I just jotted down, very interesting, this question that data has value and that conservation data has value, and anything you can measure can be turned into a game. So two big issues, maybe quickly something on audiences, new audiences and youth, and then in a second time, whoever wants, but maybe David and Gautam on conservation data as having value.
Well, I might just jump on the audience one. Absolutely. Sometimes there's a bit of a stereotype where sometimes people will say, oh, gamification is just for young people, which it's not, because if you look at the average gamer, and especially mobile games in particular, it's, females in their 40s and things like that. So it's definitely not just for the younger generations, but absolutely, because of the digital natives, kids are essentially born with iPads and phones in their hands. They know how to use it, and that shapes the way that they expect to engage with platforms. So sometimes, particularly in the workplace and in school, that's not as engaging as the games that our kids are being brought up with. So they're actually not just wanting, but actually expecting a lot more engagement and personally well-designed experiences. So there's definitely that there. So yeah, absolutely. Younger generations are actually expecting to have gamified products, and you're seeing gamification come in all sorts of apps, even just in subtle ways, because that expectation is really raising the bar.
Thank you.
I think you're totally right, Kirsten. It's just like, yeah, there's every person I talk with, it's like, oh yeah, game, that's great. I'll give it to my kids. And somehow or another, some people just don't want to admit that they also play games, whether that's video games or fantasy sports, right? Like everybody understands, and everybody understands and plays. And yeah, if you look at the statistics will show, I think it's like 78% of all mobile games and video games are played by people over the age of 22. But the other thing that sometimes gets lost in this is it's not just a matter of like, are video games well suited for kids or well suited for Gen Z, etc. But let's look at the advantages of games as a storytelling medium or games as an engagement medium, right? Like you are now active. Like if you compare to watching a wildlife documentary, like instead of kind of sitting back and leaning back, you're leaning in. You're a participant. You have an identity. You have a role. You have agency. You have to make decisions. You have to problem solve. You get an immediate feedback loop. There's a social aspect of it. So I think it's just much more than like, hey, it's just really attractive to kids, but it's actually, and you've studied this, way more than I have, but it's just a really, really effective method of engaging and keeping people engaged, also, for a longer period of time. And one of the things you mentioned was like, if there's data, we can gamify, we can figure out ways to gamify it. But the other amazing thing about games is you can gather data from what everybody's doing. And I don't mean in a spooky way, but like when presented with two options, should I throw the stick at the orangutan, or should I feed the orangutan, or should I step back? And you can see what everybody does. You can get an understanding of where are people's attitudes, where is people's knowledge, and all of that can just come through, through the fact that they're playing. So the amount of things that we could learn about audiences and people's reactions and how they're thinking about things and how they made the decision to donate or not donate, or pay or not pay. I just think the advantages of what games now, can it revolutionize and fun, that's the question that we're still trying to to find out. But can they be an effective medium across all ages, all genders, all geographies, all income levels? I mean, it's crazy. In my opinion, it's just absolutely crazy that we haven't invested more into it in the conservation space.
Thank you. This concept of agency is incredibly important. We talked about engagement, now we're talking about agency. I'm sensing one of the reasons why the Institute was interested in this also was this storytelling, but also this active participation. So that's something that I'd love to hear more on. And maybe my question to David is, your Home of Gorilla project that you described, that you're developing now, is gamification of interest? Is it at the periphery? Is it sort of at core, or what or have you given this a lot of thought or little thought?
Yeah. So, just to quickly speak into the last question, there's this Tetris game that my wife keeps playing, and I feel like it's just constant, right? So if she could get stuck onto her mobile phone because of a game like that, imagine if you could create an interesting gorilla game. Gamification is at the core of what we're doing, and the reason why is that as we've been doing our ideation, what's kept coming up is we need to rethink the persona of a conservationist, right? When I was being introduced, you mentioned David is a conservationist. Everyone should be a conservationist. The thing is, conservation should be fun, right? Because right now, conservation is a bunch of old guys in suits going into the bush and saying, "Oh, we're going to make some money and give some to the community," and it's become a play for politics and all that, right? So unless you can change that into, this is common responsibility, only then do you have more people actually coming in and jumping into the fray and saying, I'll spend $5 or $10, right? There's this little game I play where I'm driving the car up and down a hill, and every time, almost every week, I keep getting this message asking me to pay $4 so I can get so many more coins so I can buy a better car, right? And it's been done so well that I almost get to the point where I spend the money, but I don't, right? So we need to rethink, how do we get, not just the existing people involved, but even the younger, Gen Z type groups involved, and how do you do that, make it exciting? So and I like what some of the guys said around, finding ways to get them to keep giving you data and information. And one of the things we've been playing around is probably trying to create a game around virtual wardens. Okay, so it's sort of thinking through the fantasy football type structure, where now you're a warden actually making money for your national park. And what does that look like? What does it mean, right? And if we can make it even simpler and get younger kids to start playing this game early on, you then are able to nurture a whole number of people who are interested in conservation. But just going back to what I said at the start, the most important thing is we need to drive interest across multiple levels, and gamification makes that so much easier to achieve that.
Great, thank you so much.
I just want to
Please.
one quick comment, which is David's observation of how easy it is for people to spend just a few dollars here and there on games, and therefore in-game rewards, like purchase some extra coins or I level up faster, and it's like, couldn't we just take some of everybody's little dollars and put them not just to the profits of that game company, but to a real cause? Like, wouldn't that just be amazing? So anyway, I just wanted to add that.
No, this is, please, Alice, you want to react to that?
No, exactly. No, I was going to agree with that. I think so. I'm addicted to this juice jam. I have to agree. and I'm always buying bundles, to go forward, because I feel like it's very good at strategy, because it's what you do first and what you do later matters. You know, what you which route you take first matters. And so I like it for that. But I think that the way Unseen Empire caught our attention was exactly also that, because you had to get a little more credit to get farther and a little more to keep guessing. And I think we can do that. Although Adrian, some people may say, okay, it's still an 800 million or $800 billion financing gap. But every little bit counts. I know every little bit counts. And but one point I also want to make is it's not just about the money. And I think Gautam said to this all the time when I was talking to him about this game. He said, think about it as an education tool. And the little I've learned about fundraising is that nobody's going to fund your stuff unless they know what you do and they understand what you do, and you can engage them in what you do, and you can make it fun. Somebody said fun. So even it may not start out as a money thing, but actually just as an education tool, as a way to engage people in what is happening, create that empathy around all these, the elephants that are in there, or the gorillas, or the cheetahs, or the leopards. I think this starts there, because we do not get to the money before we start with that heart and mind, and then we get to the money. So I think that is an important. That's why gamification becomes interesting, a big player in this area.
Gautam, you want to jump in?
And yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think the point about the, you know, like this 800 billion, you know, whatever the number is, right? It's not small. And so if it's 800 billion, if it's 500, billion, if it's 3 trillion, which is probably what it is, right? Like that can feel overwhelming. It can seem silly to have a conversation about like, can gaming, fix that? You know what? No, it can't. Not in and of itself. But I forgot who it was that was kind of talking about it earlier. But as soon as you start shifting the way people are engaging with animals, are engaging with wildlife, and are having the opportunity to express that, and as soon as you're starting to build evidence of like, hey, wait a second, hundreds of millions engaging with wildlife and engaging with animal through these games. Now, what's the shift that starts to have on the consumer markets? And what's being offered? What's the shift that starts to have on available financing? What's the effect that starts to have on policy, right? And where people start listening to the will of the people. That's what can address those major gaps. And I really think that the role of gaming in that situation is not necessarily the specific dollars that come from it, although of course, like you say, everybody helps. But what can it catalyze in terms of how people are able to express what's important to them? And when that is expressed, I guarantee you those 3 areas listen, and those 3 areas are what are going to drive the differences for conservation here and in the future.
That's a great kind of, I don't want to call it a wrap up because I've got some questions from the audience I want to get out, but I hear a few things. One is, it is possible, it's possibly contributing to the conservation gap, although it would be foolish to think, I think the entire gaming industry is 160 billion. So if the number is higher than that, then obviously anything is fantasy, but it is significant. Also, the engagement is clearly a part of the gamification world, and the agency is the word I was looking for, that somebody threw out there as well before. And the other thing that we haven't covered a lot, but maybe we will, and it's linked to the question that I have from the panel now too, is the fact that conservation has a great story to sell, actually, and it's a question of how it can be packaged, and to maybe shift a little bit away, not entirely necessarily, but shift a little bit away from a charity model, which is continuously asking for handouts, essentially. I mean, that's what it is, to mindset, which Gautam was talking to in the beginning, where you're thinking in terms of customers, and thinking that actually conservation is sitting on a massive asset, which is, in the case of Alice, you talked about camera traps, but the story's there. So that was a great way to shift. I said I'd have some questions from the audience. I've got already a couple here that were given to me, so I'm going to read them, but this is really linked to what was talked. We have a question here about somebody a little bit provocative, which is good. We keep on talking about raising money, implying getting a donor to offer money to a specific cause. At what point should we shift from this model towards a more aggressive business model, using customer addictions and impulsions to generate revenue, not donations, independently from their concern about where the money goes. So there's a few layers to that. One is what I was talking about before about shifting from charity to non, but also, there's this potential drawback also of being accused of talking about, customer addictions and impulsions, and about appealing to people independent of their concerns. So is that, somebody want to take that one and talk to it?
I think I will. For a very long time, conservation, especially in most of Africa, has been the reserve of the government. Now, except South Africa, where you have a lot of private conservation entities running. But the thing about government is government, especially in Africa, is not very well primed to do business, right? So it's easier for them to go out and ask for the donations. So I think until we start to see more active private sector players coming into conservation, then we shall start to see, a lot more innovation in the space. I just saw an interesting note. There's a game called Farmville. I'm not sure how many of you know about Farmville. And Farmville, it's almost $1 billion revenue and is driving people to take interest in farming, right? So choosing to look at conservation that way and say, can we actively, as private sector players, come in to generate a profit? Then it starts to become more exciting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I mentioned in the chat. I think our next question is, when should we start to make the shift? And my answer is right now. We just can't afford to be shy or abashed or too. I think that this is not going to get us anywhere. I mean, one of the things that we're looking at is how can we gamble potentially on wildlife, and how can we take advantage of that entire industry, and of course do it in a way that is not as seedy or manipulative, but I think we need to start thinking about those mentalities now. And if we can get people addicted on wildlife, that's a much better addiction than many of the other addictions that people have. So that's getting back to the original question of why we started as a for-profit. It was to try and make sure that we had that mentality in what we do.
So I've got a couple of questions that are related, and I want to turn to them and talk about empathy as well. I think it was Alice, if my memory serves me right, that talked about empathy, and that's absolutely critical. We had a great thought piece coming out from a student at the University of Cambridge on our website, which I'll encourage you to have a look at. It's the power and the need for empathy if we're going to shift the needle on this. This is related. One question is around, don't you think that overwhelming attention to electronic devices just make people even more disconnected from nature? And obviously, when we talk about gamifying nature conservation, we're not actually technically talking about tech or social media or games or mobile phone, but realistically, I think that's what a lot of the attention is on, rather than board games, if you're going to get to those billions. So is there kind of a risk that we're disconnecting from nature? And then we had a question which is related, almost a different angle, but it's sort of the flip side as well, would you consider how these games may foster a sense of belonging to the natural world? So it's kind of two sides of the same coin. And again, front and center is this question of empathy. Alice, you mentioned empathy. Maybe you want to jump it, but Kirsten, also your experience of gamification and might be helpful here as well.
Yes, and those are both very interesting questions. I err on the side of the belonging, more. At least that's the experience I got from getting my daughter interested in that. Was really it was also about me telling her what I do, what I work on, and look at what I do. But I think let's also talk about the fact that I've seen that schools are starting to really jump onto this thing, and we are in the right time now where there's a lot more interest in nature. There's a lot more awareness. Even before I started to get my daughter interested, she was already at her own school learning about plastic, for example. They were watching those BBC shows about plastics. She was already learning about endangered species and how many elephants are killed per hour and whatever. So these schools also starting to latch onto this, and actually could be a good audience for us to go into, so that we're not just thinking about individuals getting addicted, but actually using school as getting these games into schools, and schools being some of the medium for this. So yes, and that's where I think empathy comes from. I actually read that article you're talking about, Adrian. It's really excellent. I would say a lot of people should read it, about empathy and how we can create empathy from engaging. So I see that as extremely valuable, but I also see that maybe it may not just be individuals, it can also be at schools level, it can be a tool to be used at school. Over.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, a really worthwhile question, and you know, as much as Adrian described me before as a believer in gamification, it's not an unaware believer. It's understanding the good, the bad, and how you can really make it work. So I think it's an important question, and whenever we design any gamified experience, we need to keep those things forefront. One, is gamification the right solution? Because it's not the right solution for everything. It has a lot of application, a lot of benefits, but it's not for everything. And then, you know, with a couple of times we've mentioned about making sure that, you know, the mechanics are good, the data collection isn't being used in, you know, nefarious ways. So those are all really important questions that gamification designers need to keep front of mind throughout the whole process. I would have a lean on the side of it. If we can create that empathy, if we can create a curiosity in a digital way, that only helps with the connection. I saw in some of the comments, and I completely agree that a lot of the times we want to connect, but we can't, whether because COVID means we can't travel, or, you know, a whole bunch of different factors that mean that we can't go and experience. Like, you know, having been to, you know, the Kruger Park and things like that, there's something so amazing about seeing the animal up close. You can't replicate that in a digital way, but can I engage with it? Can I learn information? Can I, you know, have conversations with my family about it? Absolutely. So I would say, even though technology can feel like it's opposite of nature, I think that the future is more and more we're bringing these worlds together, and there's only benefit from it.
It's fascinating. It's like we're all migrating online, and the question is, where, you know, where's nature? Where are the species? Are we going to bring them with us? That's rang to mind. I had another, I'd say almost, there's another poll. Can the for-profit social enterprise model deliver significant new revenue? Look forward to hearing your views on that. We had a question that actually is also kind of dear to my heart. I don't know who's going to answer this, but we talked about storytelling, building empathy, games, connecting, etc. And the question here is, how can gamification strategies be used to engage and generate revenue for quote unquote ugly or non-visibly critically endangered species, such as vultures, or I would extend it to, you know, critters that live below the ground, to soil, to habitats, ideas, because if I push that to its extremity, there's a risk potentially that you're increasing the funds going to the charismatic species, but not, and so you're losing that the delicate, you know, scientific approach. I see a lot of nodding heads. I don't have, Gautam, you want to give it a crack?
I think that's the responsibility of good storytelling, right? And non-Disney like storytelling, right? Like how far back do you think Disney sent hyenas? You know, with Lion King, where they're represented in a particular way, and now anybody and everybody that thinks about hyenas, or how far back, you know, are vultures sent from Jungle Book or things. That's just the responsibility of good storytelling. Game or not game, that's about good storytelling. So I've actually been part of a bid that's being made out of California on the gamification of underwater exploration for microorganisms. And you know, and you look at these things and they're spectacular, right? Like they're just, and nobody could see them, right? They would all fit within your fingernail. But if you storytell around them in the right way, I think they could be, I think it could be as interesting, more interesting, you know, than any of the iconic species. So yeah, I mean, there is just literally some willpower to just say, like, yeah, you know, we can promote many of these animals, as long as, if you can promote these fictional Pokemons, you know, in particular ways, you know, good storytellers can tell great stories about, you know, about any animal that's, you know, any animal that's out there. And I've seen really good examples, really good examples of this, not necessarily within the game space, but I just do think it's just responsible storytelling.
I agree, and I mean, it is a hard question, because, you know, if you're if you're doing a project, there's limited funds and times and things like that. And so like we actually had this question at Pentacrest a couple of months ago when we were developing a game called Kangazoo, like kangaroo, but Kangazoo. And it's about being able to explore Australia, discover different species. And I think we had, you know, time slots for 17 species. And so it's like, well, which species do we put in? Because people want to see the koalas and the kangaroos. Maybe people don't want to see the funnel web spiders and things like that. And so I think there's, you know, do you kind of get people interested with the iconic animals that they're expecting and wanting to see, but you absolutely need to tell the whole biodiversity story. And so I completely agree with Gautam. It's about really kind of, you know, telling that whole picture. And within a game, you could do things like, you know, have a challenge to find the, you know, the big five, then have a challenge to find the ugly five. Not, you probably don't want to call it that, but you know, you can make that as part of the game. And so people go, oh, okay, I've got the elephants. I don't want the elephant. I want the vulture and I want the whatever, you know.
Well, yeah, and what I find very interesting is a lot of the youth these days actually are interested in horror. So you may actually find that some of these do appeal to them. But I wanted Adrian to talk about the private sector thing. I think, and maybe bring in you, David, as well. I think, you know, we hear a lot about this term bankable solution. Most of the private sector people I engage with talk about, yeah, we want to invest there, but we are not finding any bankable projects in Africa. We're not finding any bankable there. So, and I think it links very well, David, to your work, which is, where do they see their return on investment if they come in and invest in the thing? How can you create that value so that they want to invest? And I think that's one of the things you've talked about. And I think you've also mentioned the fact, David, that governments don't think this way. I started by talking about I would like to see more government, and I still agree it's important. But yes, we must bring more private sector in. But how do we create that value? And that, I think, that is something that you're tackling, and that how do you make it bankable? How do you make conservation bankable?
I think the one thing that we have in conservation is the species, okay, or the plants or whatever it is we're trying to conserve, and building business models on top of that layer that are profitable to the investor would attract any private sector player. Now, the thing is, how does it not seem like profiteering of conservation? Right? The truth, though, is that if someone is actively investing an amount of money, they need to make a return from that the investment they're making. There's a substantial amount that is actually going to stay, you know, within the conservation areas, right? So, like in our case with Home of the Gorillas, we have a tripartite contract with the government, with the community, and with ourselves and our investors. So we go out and we raise money to say we're building great tech to be able to monetize an asset that previously was not being monetized. And this is how we're going to sell it. And we're actually going out and pitching like a pure business. There's the very clear impact that is staying with the community, but then the investors that we get into the project are also able to make a return, right? So I think it's sort of studying and understanding how many assets like that actually exist that can be monetized. I mentioned something when we began the chat around cryptocurrencies and the blockchain. I think something that we're very actively looking at. Today, you're seeing a lot of interest in a crypto that's supposed to be used on Mars. Now, we have no idea how far forward that's going to be, but in reality, if there was a crypto asset that's being sold to be able to say save the gorillas, okay, and I mean that's pretty much bragging rights, but these are bragging rights that can actually be exchanged and creating revenue for the investors, okay. So I think what needs to happen is a lot more dialogue between the government, the donors, and the private sector, be able to clearly identify what opportunities exist. Okay, because from a gamification perspective, from a games perspective, if we're doing something with the gorillas and for every dollar created, 50% or 40% is staying with the community, that's very attractive to the investor. And yet, at the same time, the community is making substantial revenue that they previously were not making. So it is dialogue that has to be deliberately set up. And I can tell you, I'm sure there's very many tech investors would be excited about. It's almost a sure deal, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I see Gorilla Lithium in the chat box. I know crypto is a contentious issue. I would love to get us started on that. We're sort of closing. Gorilla Lithium. I was thinking of crypto gorillas after crypto kitties. Maybe a topic for another day. I want to thank all of you. We're slowly running out of time. I do want to give the opportunity if there are sort of closing thoughts to any of you, but I really want to thank all of you for being here today, for sharing your thoughts, to all the panelists for joining us and asking great questions. I wasn't able to look at the whole chat, but I will look at it afterwards with great interest. There was a lot of things there. At the Luke Hoffmann Institute, as I said, with Internet of Elephants, but also Pentequest is helping with some research as well. We are trying to ask this question and try to demonstrate whether there is potential here. We like to crowdsource ideas as well. We're open to input. We'll be active in the next several months, and we really look forward to people's input. So please feel free to get in touch, at least with me. I don't want to speak for the panelists, but I think they're quite open, and they showed their passion for this topic. So I invite you to engage directly. Any closing thoughts, Alice, David, Kirsten, or Gautam?
Just that I've really enjoyed the discussion. A really, really exciting space. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed the discussion too. Yes, I think empathy, engagement, yeah, those two big words there. A whole of society approach.
I think mine is really a call. We are going out trying to ideate around this project. We need as much in terms of ideas. So, if anyone out there is interested in being part of the project from an ideation perspective, we are happy to, get in touch and just help us figure this out and make it work. Thank you very much.
Great.
Super. Yeah. Thanks very much. I don't have anything else to say other than, I saw that a lot of questions came through that we weren't able to get to.
Yeah.
I love those questions. I love talking about it. So if anybody just wants to send those to me via email or have a separate conversation, and I'm always happy to engage in that dialogue.
Me too. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for joining and for being here, the panelists. Special shout out to Kirsten, who's joined us from Western Australia. So she's deserved.
Past my bedtime.
Thank you, Adrian, too, for getting us started on this. And let's do more. Let's do more of these. Let's continue talking about this. Yeah.
Happy to. Anytime.
Right.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.